Hi. Okay, it's time for the discussion questions for Matthew chapter 7. If you haven't watched that video, go back and watch it. Or, you can always read by yourself, right? You don't have to read with me. But if you want to read with me, I read the chapters. Okay, so Matthew chapter 7 questions. So, judgment. Talk about this a lot. This is how it starts. So, what does Jesus mean by do not judge, or you too will be judged? And how does this principle of the log in your eye or the speck in someone else's illustrate the proper attitude when approaching others' faults, right? Attitude, even meaning like your mindset, your thought process, the way that you are in that situation, the way that you're thinking, even maybe your own sense of entitlement, but what does that illustrate about the proper attitude, right? I love that he's helping us. What's the proper way? And how does it challenge that approach? Because if we're honest with ourselves, I'm sure if we all look at ourselves, we'll see that there is a proper attitude and then there's the way that we do it. And so, how does this challenge your approach in correcting others? And I would say, like, what do you think is the role of humility in that, right? Like, not just why is humility in that situation important, but how can you apply humility in that situation? What would humility look like? You know, we know the difference between pride and humility, but maybe some scenarios of what's the difference and if you handle that with pride versus if you handle that with humility. Because I think for people, we know to be humble, but we don't know how to be humble or when to be humble or what being humble looks like. And so this is a great scenario to imagine yourself. What would humility look like? And then even in your life, you're able to actually start applying that. That is a great place to start applying humility, or it starts to build your awareness of humility, I guess. Your awareness that you are no better, that you are not perfect, that you have stuff to work on, causes you to have so much more grace and patience for other people with other people. And that really causes you to lead your life and live your days differently because you no longer are walking around actually convinced that you're better than. Um, and it'll change your relationships because it'll not only change from yourself the way that you actually see people, but it'll change the way you treat them. And so then from their point of view, they will have a different relationship with you. Um, and then So that's like question one, or the kind of a few different questions in the intro. Uh, and then I mentioned the two different types of judgment. And so, are there times when judgment is necessary? Um, and what's the balance between the Lord saying not to judge versus having discernment? And so remember when I said that judgment, there's the difference between judgment, which is a bias and a prejudice and a stereotype, versus judgment that is decision making. When you make a judgment call, when you are decisive, when you are discerning, right? Discerning is like, I have information, I have clarity, and I'm going to make a decision. So the difference between the Lord telling us to be discerning, especially when he was talking about the false prophets and the false disciples and knowing them by their fruit, and knowing that people are masquerading whatever their inner life is like, and they're pretending on the outside, right? So the difference between being discerning and being able to say, something's not right here. I'm not sure if I should, or I should back away from this situation, or I shouldn't get close to this person, versus you judging them, right? And judgment meaning like you're condemning them. You're saying that person deserves these consequences, versus like we've learned, love your enemies, right? Maybe you see some of those things going on and you pray for those people and you think, wow, clearly there is not a yielding to the Lord. And so I want that for them. And rather than me feeling like I have the right to judge and say what consequences they deserve or what the outcome of their life is going to be, I also know that just like I was in those shoes, that they could have a testimony, and that I can't think I'm better than them because I need to be forgiven just as they need to be forgiven, that I can be discerning in walking away from them while also wanting the best for them. So anyway, so that's some uh, perspective on that, but I would just discuss that. Um, let's see. Okay, so what is the promise that it says Jesus' promise of asking, seeking, and knocking teach us about God's nature? And how does it relate to prayer and our relationship with the Lord? So, just like when he says, I'm a good father, if you will give your kids these things, why would I not give? So, when Jesus is telling us that we have the freedom, the ability, the access, the right to ask, seek, and knock, what does that tell us about one, God's nature of willing to be asked, to be sought, and to be knocked? um, but and then also what it says about prayer and our relationship with the Lord. So when we talk to him and how we relate to him, and being willing or being aware that we can come to him and we can ask, and we can come to him and we can seek, and we can come to him and we can knock. And like that is what prayer can be. And then also just our relationship with him. What is it? What place is it putting him in? What place is it putting us in? Um, let's see. Okay, why do you think Jesus emphasizes the golden rule? We talked about how in elementary school, it's like on the wall and it says, do to others as you have them do to you. So he emphasizes that. Remember, he says this fulfills the law and prophets. It's like this is the gospel, basically. This is love, basically, is what he's saying. Um, and how does that rule tie into the whole message of the Sermon on the Mount? Almost if like that was a summary of the Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. So think back on everything we've learned in the Sermon on the Mount. How is that rule evident? Maybe go into each section, right? Is it evident in each section of a do unto others as you'd have them do to you? And then how can you live out that teaching in your daily relationships? Right? It's all about application. How do you live it out? If you know to treat others the way you want to be treated, or do unto them as you'd have them do to you, how can you live that out? And it does not say do to your friends as you'd have them do to you. It says do to others, meaning everyone, including your enemies, right? We've learned to love our enemies. So do to others, anyone, even those you want to judge, even those that are false prophets, even those that are hypocrites, and do unto them as you'd have them do to you. Okay, what do we think Jesus means by the narrow road, few find it? And how does this contrast to the wide road of destruction? So why does he say that the narrow road is one that few find? And how is that contrasted with the not hard to find path of destruction? Um, okay, the next part of that. What does it mean? Or I guess if we know entering through the narrow gate is following Christ, but maybe define that. Like to enter through the narrow gate, it relates to our choice in following Christ, right? So what that looks like, how following Christ is the narrow gate. I kind of elaborated on this. Um, and how does that challenge the cultural views of salvation? Of kind of like everyone can just like say, and this kind of ties into the Lord, Lord, you'll call out Lord, Lord, and I didn't know you. But how everyone can just say that they're a Christian versus what it actually looks like to have a life that is walking through the narrow gate and following Christ. I would think Sadie Robertson just said something about this, or now her name's like Sadie Huff. But she was talking about how so many people will say Christian, but the point is following Christ. So I feel like that needs to be the new definition. How many of us are following Christ? Meaning he goes before us, he leads the way, he maps out our life, and we go where he goes. We follow what he says. And we know that that is the path, or that is salvation, right? That is being born again. Because if you want to say that you know Jesus or choose Jesus, but you still want to go down your own path and you want to choose your own way and lead your own life, then you can't follow both, right? And he says you can't serve two masters. We already read that yesterday. But it's like and you can't be your own master, basically. Or your own dreams or your own plans can't be your master. But it's like, have you completely given up your authority to yourself, your autonomy, or in your autonomy, you say, I know that I have a choice to choose myself or the Lord, and I choose the Lord. That is what it means to be Christian. It means to follow Jesus. And so again, just the difference between what cultural Christianity is versus actually going through the narrow gate, the narrow road, following Christ. Okay, so we learned about the false prophets and how we recognize them by their fruits. So how can you discern truth from error? When I say R's like that, they just sound like one big R. Error. I'm saying ERROR. How can we discern truth from error in today's world, especially with the ideas of different spiritual teachings, ideologies? I would even say like blended faith. People that are reading this and telling you what it says. Oh, there's the answer right there. Read it for yourself. That's what we're doing right now. When you read it for yourself, you know what it says. But to discern truth, right? He talked about the fruit. I talked about discernment a little bit or a lot of it in that. As you go out into the world, how can you be discerning to tell what is true and what is false? The sun is coming out on me today. Look at this. I'm two different colors. Okay, we're almost done. So when he says, Lord, 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 right? Those that are pretentious, those that maybe haven't received true salvation in the sense of surrendering their heart and their life entirely to the Lord. How does this change the idea of easy believism, which is what I was calling cultural Christianity, versus the evidence of a true transformation? That's what I love, is true transformation makes itself evident. No one needs to tell you they're transformed. You will see it. So maybe again, it's even just discuss that, the difference between, and even in yourself, have you let yourself be truly transformed? Have you looked at your fruit? Assess your life. And if you want fruit, realize that it's going to come from a true transformation, but that you don't need to convince anyone of a transformation. The fruit will tell. And this is why it's good to have checkpoints in with yourself. But that just sobering reality of there can be people that call on the Lord, there can be behavior and there can be pretense and you act a certain way, which is people trying to say like, oh, I believe. But remember, even the demons believe. That's what I said. And what the Bible says. But it's more of, do you believe in your heart? And again, when you believe in your heart, you choose him. Choose meaning preference. You prefer him over all other things, including yourself. Preference meaning priority. You prioritize him over all other things, including yourself. Like if you love him, you make him your priority, you make him your preference. And when you do that, you believe in your heart. You have to really believe. It's not a mental thing of like, oh, I just don't want to go to hell and I know that God's real, because like that's just the easy thing to do in life, whatever. It's like, actually, easy isn't necessarily the right word. To let yourself be fully transformed, to let yourself completely break and be shattered, be broken open, isn't necessarily easy, but it's freeing. It's freeing and it's powerful and it's beautiful and it's wonderful and it's good. And then you know that you're safe with him because you're breaking with him and he is the power that's flowing through you and he's healing everything and bringing it all back and bringing it all into completion and into success and into accomplishment. And so it's like something we have to experience, but the only way to experience it is in trust. So, talking about the difference between just merely performing religious activities and the will of the Father versus, choosing to follow the will of God, right? It's your will or his will, your will or his will. So again, how can you ensure that you are truly following God and not just outwardly appearing religious? This is important. And I want to say, like, again, it's really easy to look at other people and say they act religious and they need the transformation, but it goes back to the judgment. Let's not look at other people. Send this to a friend if they need it and they can focus on themselves, but focus on you. How are you just appearing religious? Are you just doing religious things, or are you actually following the Lord every single step of your life and letting him like completely disrupt and destroy your plans and your way of doing it and your timing? Okay, the parable of the wise builder, and the importance between hearing and doing God's word. Um, and so I talked about this, what it means to build our life on the rock. So how can you apply that to your everyday life? Building your life on a rock, on a firm foundation, on Jesus Christ as your firm foundation, on truth, right? On truth, not on pretense, not on faking, but on the truth of the Lord, on love, on treating others the way you want to be treated, on all these things we've been learning, right? With Him as the foundation, how can you apply that to your everyday life? And how would you even say that um, the foundation you build your life on, how does that apply to the entire Sermon on the Mount? What has Jesus given us in the entire Sermon on the Mount as a foundation? What does the foundation look like? He's basically told us. It's like, what does it look like? Like, what will your life look like as a believer? What is this foundation to start with? If you start with this foundation, how then everything else um, it sounds like what he's saying is like, then everything else will fall into place. Like everything else will be okay. I even think about the firm foundation. I forgot to say this, but there's a time in the Old Testament, I think it's Ezekiel, and he says like, you threw the building together and you basically put whitewash on it. And he's saying like, you're trying to make it look on the outside like this building. And this is a lot of what happened, like what we have now in modern day architecture. He was like, you just slapped a building together and covered it in a whitewash. And he said, but when the torrential rains come, the building won't stand. Like that building will fall, and then people will be woeful and they will say, we trusted in this building. Like, what happened? We thought that it was good. And so it's like your deception is hurting the other people because they think that they can believe in it or whatever. And so just realizing when you do these things that the Lord's telling you to do, how is that a building your life on a rock, building your house in a way that it will withstand difficult times in life? How is this advice, this teaching of Jesus showing you how you will withstand the storms, how you will have the strength, the endurance, the durability for when life comes, right? I keep saying what can be shaken will be shaken, and then what is unshakable is true. And the Lord is saying all this stuff is unshakable. So when the storms come, you are in a house. My stepdad's a builder, and we've talked about this. The whole point of being in a house is that it can be storming outside and I'm safe in here, right? So I want to be able to be in a house that I trust. And so saying when you build your house on the Lord, like you will get through the storm. Doesn't mean the storm doesn't come. Also, some people might even be afraid of the storm, even though they're inside, but it's like the storm's not going to get you. Let me see. I think there's one more. Um, okay, I would say, what's the difference between someone who hears the word and does the word? And James talks about this too. James 1, he says, do not be merely hearers of the word, but be doers. And just so you know, the definition of obedience is when you hear and you do. The definition of disobedience is when you hear and you don't do. So both of them you hear. It's like you heard the command. Disobedience isn't someone that has never been told the command. It's when you have been told what to do and you don't do it. And so that's why too, when it says, uh, how can they call on a God that they don't believe? And how can they believe if they haven't heard? And then how can they hear if you don't tell them? So if we are telling the truth, if we are reading this word, now there's no excuse. The people have heard, you have heard, and now you get to choose what you do. You have heard the truth. Are you going to hear it and obey it? Or are you going to hear it and disobey it? Or hear it and do it? Or hear it and not do it? Um, and so then finally, the summary of it all, how can this challenge your personal walk with Christ? This entire thing. I wouldn't even just say Matthew 7. I would say the entire Sermon on the Mount. Um, what steps can you take to live out these principles more fully in your daily life? I would go through each section. I mean, you heard me talk about it and break down each section, but I would go through each section and be like, how can I apply this to my life? And I'm sure that there's certain sections you struggle with more than others. There's some that are probably easy, and then some where you're like, okay, Lord, here's where we need to meet. And is there a part of Matthew 7 that stands out? Not even Matthew 7. I want to say again, the whole Sermon on the Mount. Is there one that stands out? We've asked before, or I've asked before, if there's one area that's the one that you need the most work on. But I would also say if there's one that stands out the most. Maybe you think it's the best teaching. Maybe you think it's just like so true and it resonates and it's something you've experienced firsthand in your life. Like what stands out to you the most in the Sermon on the Mount? And like I said, go back through into each section and be like, how can I apply this in my daily life? Like, what does this actually look like? What does judging look like? Not just biblically, what does it look like at work? Or what does it look like in my friend group? Or what does it look like in my family? Or same with, you know, prayer. What does this look like in my daily life? How can I pray different? Or how am I, learning to pray? Or where can I learn to pray? Or be more intentional and intimate with the Lord and not make it seem like it's this, professional speech I have to give and trying to like put on a show and thinking I have to perform and say things a certain way or whatever. So just going through each section and applying it to your life. So anyway, I hope this helps and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.